Yes, we're going to talk about George Kambosos Jr. and Devin the Dream Haney, the undisputed fight coming up this weekend. But you know we got to talk about the results of that Gervonta Tank Davis fight and Rolly Romero. Roll that beautiful beam footage.
Hey, hear him. Down goes Frazier. Down goes Frazier.
Hey, what's up with it, fam? It's Hot Boxing Minute, your favorite pharmaceutical engineer turned boxing analyst, back at you with the realness as only I can dish it. Now, I want to talk about this upcoming undisputed title fight, but first, let's talk about this past weekend. In front of a capacity crowd, a record crowd for a boxing audience in Brooklyn, New York City at the Barclays Center, the boxing superstar, apparently at this point, according to the numbers, Gervonta Tank Davis got that 6th round knockout stoppage over a very game and outspoken Rolando Romero. I was thoroughly entertained by the event. Now, as this event built up, I started to notice a disconnect, folks. There seems to be a disconnect between old media and new media when it comes to things like the Gervonta Davis fight with Rolly Romero. Old media, those guys were steadily making fun of it online. But new media, we knew. It wasn't difficult to see how Rolando Romero had grasped the attention span of the youth in these streets. So it was a fascinating dichotomy. On one hand, you had the old media that was stuck in their old ways that were constantly knocking Gervonta Davis versus Rolly Romero. And then you had the new media, which essentially helped Rolando Romero become the meme king and help him sell this fight to a level of popularity you really see very few fights, folks. I went to 2 different gyms and youngsters were coming up to me asking about that fight. At the math center I tutor at, the youngsters were asking me about Tank Davis versus Rolly Romero. I never hear the youngsters asking me about boxing matches, let alone one like Gervonta Davis versus Rolly Romero, one that old media would have deemed as relatively unimportant. Take with that information or process that as you will. I thought that fight was awesome. I was looking forward to it. Anything that brings new eyes to the sport will always be something that I support. I will never be stuck in some inability to adapt or to change. As much as I love history, I always love big, bright, eye-catching, attention type of entities inside the game of boxing. There's always been that circus kind of feel to boxing. You can't knock Rolly Romero for being like that. Either way, Tank Gervonta Davis showed us what we already knew about him. He's a great technician, a low-volume dude that definitely has power in both hands that he depends on. It's very interesting to see Tank Gervonta's style because he has a lot of similarities to Canelo Alvarez in that he is a low-volume thrower. He doesn't throw a lot of punches per round. He does not care about losing some of the early rounds while he's sitting there trying to figure out his opponent, and he has game-changing power. And that was all on display in this recent fight against Rolando Romero. Makes sense why Canelo thinks so highly of Tank Gervonta Davis. Clearly, they both see a lot of similarities in their approach to fighting. Now, a lot of people did think that Rolando Romero was doing very well. He was backing Tank Davis up. It was very unusual because I want to say Tank Davis might have thrown something like, he was averaging something like 4 to 10 punches per round up until that 6th round where he finally caught Rolly Romero lacking. Rolly dived in. He was going low with that 2, trying to throw up with the jab. And then Gervonta Davis came in with that kind of left hook, put all of his weight into it. He said it wasn't even his most powerful punch, but he connected right on the button. Rolando Romero went down. He got up at about the 8th. The referee did his job correctly. Rolando Romero was out on his feet, folks. I know a lot of people are saying the ref might have ended the count early, but no, it was very clear. There was nobody home. You can't hide the stanky legs. When the legs go stanky, it's time to throw in the towel, folks. The fight is done. It was the right call on the ref's part. Anyways, you had to give it up to Gervonta Tank Davis. Star power, shining as bright as ever. That man packed the Barclays Center. I can't wait to see what these pay-per-view numbers look like because I'm pretty sure that they did very, very well, judging by the response that I was seeing in the streets for this fight. So what's next for Gervonta Tank Davis? Obviously, there's the potential fight between Devin Haney and George Kambosos, or the winner of that. There's obviously the money fight with Ryan Garcia, a rematch with Isaac Cruz, and then there's also Michel Rivera, the hard hitter from the Dominican Republic, who's also next in line to challenge him, according to the WBA ranking systems. And you know what? I like the idea of Michel Rivera getting the next shot at Tank Gervonta Davis, but let's see how these chips fall in the future. I guess we'll find out soon enough. Now, let's talk about this undisputed fight. I'm going to change gears. Give my credit to Gervonta Tank Davis where it's due. That man gets his flowers. Rolly Romero still got a great future in front of him. One loss is not a game changer. I'm pretty sure the rest of the boxing world, like myself, was very intrigued at the kind of attention that Rolly Romero was capable of generating. I'm sure he'll get some big money fights in the future. Don't front, man. Rolly Romero is going to do all right, you guys. Now, we've got finally an undisputed title fight coming up this weekend. Now, make sure, folks, when you're out there to tell your friends boxing is in a great place right now. We have been getting the best fighting the best, undisputed title fights left and right. I mean, earlier during the year, just a couple weeks ago, we had... See, this is what happens when I get excited, y'all. I start getting tongue-tied and starts, you know what I mean? I really do. I just get excited and I start getting tongue-tied with my words. Like I was saying, now is a better time than ever to be a boxing fan, folks. The best are fighting the best. Arenas are getting packed, and we have undisputed fights back to back to back. We just got done with Jermell Charlo versus Brian Castano. Before that, we saw Katie Taylor fight Amanda Serrano. Franchon Cruz DeZern fought Sideros and ended up getting an undisputed title. That's 3 of them already. Before that, we had the infamous fight between Jack Cattrall and Josh Taylor. And now coming up this weekend in Australia in front of an expected 55,000 capacity crowd at Marvel Stadium. We've got George Kambosos Jr. and Devin Haney going heads up. Boxing fans, are you not entertained? I am looking forward to this fight. And I think any really hardcore, diehard boxing fan, obviously, has some vested interest in this fight. It's undisputed. Devin Haney, who was getting crazy money in his DAZN deal, decided to take a little bit of a pay cut. I don't want to run with that storyline because, we could talk about Devin Haney taking a pay cut, but we can also talk about how George Kambosos Jr. has essentially been the road warrior up until this point in his career, fighting overseas, taking less pay, getting in fights with Mickey Bay or fighting, who was the other guy out there in the UK, Lee Selby, up until this point in George Kambosos' career, he's been the road warrior, taking less pay. When he went out there in NYC and he fought Teofimo Lopez, before that he fought Lee Selby, before that he fought Mickey Bay. None of these fights were at home, so I don't knock him for emphasizing that Devin Haney shouldn't really be stressing about taking a pay cut, because I'm sure Devin Haney is still getting paid quite handsomely. But, we Americans, USA, we're an entitled lot, and I'm not really sure what that's all about, but that's how we are. Nothing wrong with that. Devin the Dream Haney, he took that trip out there to Australia. He is out there without his dad. His dad had that previous conviction from the early 90s. Australia has very strict travel rules, and therefore Devin the Dream Haney's father, Bill Haney, who has been his lifelong trainer, potentially might not be in that corner. Up until this point, it seems he has not yet been allowed visa entry into the country of Australia. So Devin the Dream Haney will be leaning upon, what's his name? Oh, goodness. The guy from Brooklyn that fought Floyd Mayweather Jr., Zab Judah. Zab Judah's father, Yoel Judah, will be stepping in as the replacement for Bill Haney, which is not a bad compromise. Yoel Judah does have championship coaching experience. He trained his son, Zab Judah, and even got Zab Judah to the undisputed 140-pound crown years ago. So we do know he's experienced. He knows these pressure situations, and he is, in fact, Devin the Dream Haney's godfather. I'm sorry, Zab Judah is. So there is strong ties there. There is already some established chemistry. Devin the Dream Haney has not just been training with Bill Haney his whole life. Devin the Dream Haney, much like Shakur Stevenson, has been traveling all around the country with his father, and they've been training with some of the best trainers in the game. So, unfortunately, Ben Davison isn't allowed to get entry into Australia due to his ties to the Kinahan organized crime group. And he did that to himself, and I guess one could say the same thing for Bill Haney. In his past, he did it to himself, although I think Australia should at least give some kind of exception to Bill Haney, because I have no doubt, folks, that Australia in the past has allowed either celebrities or athletes to enter their country that have had criminal backgrounds because they're generating at least some kind of money or attention for their country. In this case, it's an international sporting event. So I don't really know why Australia wouldn't grant Devin Haney's dad entry into it when there's millions to be generated. But it is what it is. It looks like Devin Haney's going to be going with Yoel Judah for the time being. So we have the technician, Devin the Dream Haney. Much like Shakur Stevenson in his fights, he wins most of his fights very dominantly on the cards. He's one of those guys that skills pays the bills. We've seen Devin Haney get touched. We've seen Devin Haney touch other people. Touch other people. I don't know if that's the correct language, but Devin Haney can be touched. And, when it comes to Devin the Dream Haney, I don't really buy into this glass chin nonsense. He got rocked by Linares, and everyone says he's got a glass chin. I don't know what that's about. We saw Vasily Lomachenko hit the ground in a flash knockdown by Linares, but nobody questions Vasily Lomachenko's chin. We saw George Kambosos get knocked down by Teofimo Lopez, but nobody questions George Kambosos' chin. So I'm not one of the people that questions Devin Haney's chin. There's just no point in it because technically he has not been knocked down or knocked out. You got to give that man the benefit of the doubt. So Devin the Dream Haney, undefeated at this point. What's his current record? Devin Haney is 27-0 with 15 knockouts. George Kambosos Jr. is 20-0 with 10 knockouts. I wouldn't say either of these guys. When it comes to being a knockout threat, George Kambosos Jr. and Devin Haney are roughly in the same boat. Neither of them are what you would consider power monsters, but yet both of them have enough pop to at least keep their opponents honest. From what we've seen thus far in both of their careers, though they might not be overwhelming power punchers, they both definitely will keep their opponents honest, at the least. I think when it comes to just sheer skills pay the bills and who's more technical, I would have to give it to Devin the Dream Haney. Clearly, I think if you watch both careers, if you've seen George Kambosos, he looked excellent in that fight against Teofimo Lopez. I would venture to say he caught Teofimo Lopez really overlooking him, but regardless, he won that fight in a relatively unanimous decision fashion. Now, George Kambosos might throw his combinations a little bit faster, but I think Devin the Dream Haney overall is just a much slicker and much more technically adept fighter. But George Kambosos Jr. does have grit, and he does have self-confidence, which is not something that Devin Haney is lacking, but George Kambosos Jr.'s self-confidence is really something special. It really is up there with some of the top-level legit self-confidence of anybody else in the game. And as we have seen in the history of combat sports, self-confidence, determination mixed with some grit and some reasonable amount of fighting skills can present a problem for anybody. Devin the Dream Haney has his work cut out for him going up against George Kambosos Jr. Now, I think when it comes to Devin Haney versus George Kambosos Jr., I think we're all aware that it's an uphill battle for Devin Haney. He's fighting in hostile territory. He's out there in Australia. It's going to be 55,000 screaming Aussies in Marvel Stadium, and they're all going to be rooting for George Kambosos. So that kind of loud auditory input can affect judges' decisions. On top of that, there might be some, funny business going on with the judges. Devin the Dream Haney is going to have to make this a convincing, one-sided washing or get the stoppage. That's about his only avenues for winning here. George Kambosos Jr. just has to put on a really good show, and really anything about drawish level or better, anything to the skill, anything exhibited in the skill department by George Kambosos Jr. that at least gets him a draw in the general viewer's eyes will likely get him the win and a successful defense of his titles. There is a rematch clause too. So should Devin the Dream Haney win, he will have to run it back with George Kambosos Jr. So this could potentially play out for 6 months to 9 months, barring unforeseen circumstances. We saw what happened with that Triller fight with Teofimo Lopez and George Kambosos Jr. It might draw out for a year. We don't really know. Keep our best hopes up in that whatever happens in that fight, win, lose, or draw, they have the immediate rematch. But when it comes to Devin the Dream Haney versus George Kambosos Jr., I'm going to say it. I'm leaning in favor of Devin the Dream Haney. I think we're going to see one of the best performances of Devin the Dream Haney's career. Of course, you never want to overlook George Kambosos Jr. He's clearly a dog. But I think Devin Haney knows the task in front of him, and he knows that he has no choice but to either get a wash, a visible wash, to the eyes of fans, or get the stoppage. And I'm leaning in favor of Devin the Dream Haney. Boxing fans, how do you think this fight plays out? Let me know in the comment section. Let's chop this up. Anyways, y'all, that's the end of my video. Hit like, hit follow if you haven't already done so. Leave a comment. This is Hot Boxing Minute, y'all. The future of boxing analysis on social media.